Thank you. Can you guys all hear us?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. Well, given we are limited on time, let's just jump right in. And Evan, first of all, thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure. Excited to be here.
I thought before we kind of dive into the juicier topics, we could start with just kind of background, like tell everyone a little bit about what your role is right now with the league, how long you've been there, and sort of the team that you oversee.
Sure. So I've been with the league about 10 years, actually, which seems to have flown by. And I head up a department called Basketball Strategy and Analytics. And basically, we're responsible for overseeing all data, strategy, and technology as it relates to the on-court product, so the NBA game of basketball. And so in that role, we're focused on everything from referee performance to the integrity of the competition, maximizing player health and reducing injuries, and looking at how to maximize fan engagement with the rules of the game, the structure of the season, and just trying to leverage data analytics and technology wherever we can to do that. So I've got a fairly large group that has a cross section of data scientists, strategists, basketball experts, some economists, some like sort of more developer types. Really a diverse group of folks who just come at this from a lot of different perspectives, thinking about the game of basketball.
And how big is that team today?
We are about 30.
And 10 years ago when you got there, how big was it?
So I actually started my career at the NBA on the business side of the league. My first job at the league was redesigning the revenue sharing plan right as the 2011 lockout got underway. So if you want to trial by fire at a sports league, definitely try to figure out a plan for 30 billionaires to share their money. That was a challenge. But over time, what evolved was this idea that there are a lot of different people thinking about the game strategically, analytically, quantitatively in different areas of the league office. So I think you're right, there was like very small group that was specifically focused on this, but others who were peripherally doing work around, let's say, the referee side or the fan engagement side. And so what we did about 6 years ago was just bring all that together in a centralized fashion to try to bring some synergy to the way we were all attacking similar problems within the league office. So it's definitely grown, but maybe not as much as the numbers would suggest because it was more of a reorganization.
So let's just jump right in on referees because I feel like when I mentioned to people this week that I was going to be having this conversation with you, that was the number one thing that kept coming up. I thought maybe we could start with walking through an example where your team uses data and kind of goes through the process of actually leading to something that ultimately becomes a rule change.
Are you focused on the actual refereeing side or more a basketball rule change?
I think let's start with the rule side. That's certainly the one that I think fans are primarily interested in. When you actually get to a point where you're going to make a change on the court in the product, what's the process behind that? What goes into that?
Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't necessarily manifest itself as narrow as let's say a rule change to basketball, but I'll give you a few examples. So the simplest one is intentional fouling, right? That we had this hack a Shaq problem a number of years ago, and in addition to just being sort of aesthetically ugly, what you can see when you look at let's say the minute by minute viewership of any game, tracking Nielsen ratings and things, is you can actually see people tuning out when teams resort to that strategy, right? And so we were able to make not just a basketball case, but a business case that this is a negative from a perception standpoint for our game. And so we ultimately, changed a rule there based on that fan engagement data to essentially eradicate intentional fouling, at least in the last 2 minutes of quarters. It's of course stopped more generally across the game now for various other strategic reasons, but that was one. Sort of more macro thing that we look at that I don't know if it falls in your category of rule change, but I always find interesting is we developed a metric internally that we call the basketball quality score. And it's trying to bring together all elements of gameplay to understand, what's happening on the court. So that could be the competitiveness of the games, average score margin throughout. It could be the sloppiness, right? Non-steal turnovers. It could be how well defenses are contesting shots, star minutes, kind of bucketing all that into like, what was the quality of any individual game? And something we saw, which probably isn't surprising to a lot of fans, is that metric, the average for that metric actually decreases over the course of a season, and specifically kind of craters towards the end of a season when teams are more solidified into either playoff or non-playoff positions. Those that are out of the playoffs maybe had incentive to drop even further for draft purposes, of course. and teams in the playoffs maybe had incentive to scale back their star minutes to prepare for the playoffs. And so we used that data to make two fairly fundamental changes to the league. One was the draft lottery changes a number of years ago to try to reduce that incentive to race to the bottom. And the other you're seeing now, it started off last season and growing this season with the play-in tournament, because the idea that if you can create more tiers in the standing, so it's not just top 8, bottom 7 in a conference, that there's a reason to reach the top 6 to lock in a playoff spot. There's a reason to get to the 7 to 10 range to be in the play-in and bring more teams into the fold. We actually anticipate we're going to see a higher level of competition in the latter part of the year, which again would drive up that quality metric that we track. So there's a lot of different sort of micro and macro examples of where we're using data to try to shape the product.
So let me piggyback off that, because this is something I've thought about for years in terms of game design, where in game design, there's this balancing principle of skill versus luck, right? Like a game like chess is mostly skill, basically. And so your variance is not going to be extreme from player to player, whereas the card game of war is just all luck. If you think about something in terms of basketball structure, the March Madness tournament is a single elimination tournament. So you're introducing more variability by having a smaller sample size. So you increase excitement typically in that case, right? But you sacrifice that maybe for skill, where you don't always have your 1 seeds or your best teams in the final 4. How do you guys think about that or approach that when it comes to something like making a decision change for, say, the play-in tournament, or I guess it was before your time, but length of playoff rounds, right, from 3 to 5, or the length of the schedule in the season even?
Yeah, you should talk to some professional war players. They might argue that there's more skill in that. It's a mind game.
Is that a thing?
I would guess Seth would know, but if I had to bet, I would say as a former poker player myself, people will call themselves professional in anything. So it's a great point. Basketball is a very unique sport, especially the way we've structured it. The things that tend to lead to variability or less variability in outcomes are more scoring opportunities within a game, right? More games and more games in a playoff series. And we have the most of all of those things, right? That there are 80 something shots per game per team, right? So 100 possessions roughly. There are very small variances in each team's scoring probability on any given possession. But when you play that out over those 100 possessions and over those 82 games, you get a very clear picture of the actual skill level of those teams, right? Versus an NFL season where there's far fewer possessions, so far fewer scoring opportunities, and 20% of the games, only 16 games. And so you get a lot more randomness in team record, right, as reflective of overall team skill. And so, there's a bunch of studies that have been done that you could basically play an NBA season over 25, 30 games and get to roughly the same assessment of the good teams and the bad teams. And so that's just a sort of open item for us is, well, do we want to have all of these games to get to the point where we can, with real precision and refinement, know who are the best teams and who are the worst teams? And how does that balance with the entertainment quality of those games and the need to fill RSN contracts, the need to fill arenas and provide opportunities for season ticket holders and such to attend games? So that's a tension that's always existed, and we're studying that continually over time. The playoff length then is another issue, because in a 7-game series, right, small differences in teams are going to play themselves out much more than they would in a knockout. And that cuts both ways too, because on the one hand, you'd like to introduce more randomness and excitement to our playoffs. But on the other hand, our fans really want to see our best teams go head to head in the later rounds of the playoffs. So I'm not sure that our product would necessarily be served by having more 7 and 8 seeds upsetting our top teams, because we are a fairly star-driven league. People want to see our star players play in the conference finals and finals. So that's a tension there as well. We think the play-in is actually a really nice blend of the two, because it's basically saying that the teams that have earned their way into a definitive playoff spot, the top 6 teams in each conference, they're going to get the benefit of the 7-game series. Teams 7 through 10, they're going to have single game knockouts, right? 7's going to play 8 this year. The winner's going to get the 7 seed. 9's going to play 10. The loser's out. And then the loser of the 7-8 versus the winner of the 9-10 will get the 8 seed. And so you'll get these sort of high intensity knockout games that we only get in a game 7 context, and those are variable. We only have so many game 7s each year. So to create that tiering where there's sort of locked in teams, the knockout teams, and then the lottery teams, we think is a nice way to bring a little bit more of that randomness into the fold.
And just one more thing about everything you just said in there, the schedule length. Obviously, that's a topic of conversation for so many people, and one of the things that again, I had a lot of people inundating me with questions about schedule length. We're at 72 this year. Obviously, we've had some variability because of craziness in the world. I guess if you can't separate the business considerations from those, right? I think that's probably the sweet spot your team and the league are trying to always hit. What seems like possibilities based on data you're seeing? Are you guys waiting to see the reaction to this season? Talk just a little bit more about any possibility for changing schedule and how that would work.
Yeah, honestly, it's a balance of that economic and basketball tension, right? I don't think anyone would argue that if you had fewer games, that two things happen. One, each game means more competitively by definition, right? Each game has more marginal impact on a team's playoff qualification chances. And therefore, you'd also expect a higher overall quality of play in those games for any number of reasons, either because the games mean more, that teams are going to have to go all out in them, that if you use the same calendar footprint, that fewer games would mean less density, fewer back-to-backs, and if we did that, presumably more star player participation, right? So you would expect the sort of average quality of likability of any individual game to go up. However, it's not clear that likability is going to translate into the incremental revenue that you would need to justify cutting out all those games from a ticketing standpoint, from a RSN value standpoint. And so that's the tension that we're studying. And obviously this year we used it as a bit of an innovative year, but also a transitional year to try to get back on track to our normal calendar for the 21-22 season. And so the reason we felt we needed to finish by that mid-late July timeframe was twofold. One, we want to avoid competition with the Olympics, right, which start July 23rd, and try to get back on track to that mid to late October start for 21-22. And we calculated that we could only fit in 72 games without really going too far on the density and back-to-back points. So that's how we ended up at 72 for this year. But yeah, we'll be studying the data and look at sort of how fans react to any individual game. And if there's a case that the average engagement and interest in any game does move up commensurately with the reduction in games, then you can make a business case to do that. But that's a tough equation, right? So like, as an example, if you cut 20% of games out, you'd have to believe that there's 25% more interest in any given game in order to get back to that same, and that would have to translate to ticket prices, to TV contracts, et cetera, just to get back to that same level of revenue. And so the only other thing we think of then is, okay, well, what if you cut the number of games and then you use the space in the calendar that creates to add new tent poles, right? Add new tournaments like a secondary cup and in-season tournament. Use that to create a larger play-in tournament because you've got the space in the calendar. And if those types of things can recoup the value that you might lose from the fewer regular season games, now you might have more of a business case to do that. So it's not just about regular season games for us. It's very much about competitive meaning and fan interest throughout the year.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that sometimes is very subtle, where the amount of revenue you necessarily need to make up to kind of like make up for that gain in incremental fan engagement in those specific games is actually larger than it probably intuitively feels for people. Oh, there's a bump in the improvement of excitement, but when you strip away 20% of the games to do that, you're losing a lot. Let's jump back to the on-court product, because I have, as a historian, I have a lot of sort of thoughts and interest in how much offense is too much offense. And right, we've seen a lot of offense lately, and there's certainly a lot of rule changes over the years that have supported that offense, along with, of course, strategy and on-court analytics-based stuff. But I think right now, as of this conference, we're at about 112 points per 100 for the league average offensive rating, which is, again, another record, breaking the record from last year, from the year before, and on and on and on. So let me stop there and just start with the high-level question. How much offense is too much offense from your standpoint?
I could throw it back to you. I mean, I assume every fan has a different answer to that question. So I'd be curious for yours. Are we there? Are we at too much offense in your view?
Maybe a little bit. I don't, I actually, for me personally, I don't know if I would frame the question um, in a vacuum. It's more about the advantages that the offense and defense are having as they
Okay.
pertain to on-court entertainment or flow state. So the
Yep.
one that always comes up is the shooters getting rewards that other
Yep.
players on the court don't get, whether that's landing space or, you know, jumping into a defender or things like that. And in conjunction with other rules that didn't used to be sort of um, benefited or given to the offense 20 years ago that are now
Okay.
happening now. I think that's the space that I'm kind of asking about. Is
Got
that
it. Yeah. No,
is that never
that
ending?
that's fair, right? So I was just curious. The reason I asked that is because it is sort of a very individualized question, right? So I may have a personal view about the level of offense in the league. If you ask our fans, and we do, not surprisingly, extensive fan surveying, and we've even done dial testing, right, where fans are literally sitting watching games with a kind of a dial like you might see during a political debate and turning it up or down based on whether they enjoy what they're seeing. The overwhelming response in all of that research is that fans like the high score. Now, that doesn't mean that that's universal. There are certainly those on the other side of that, but the ratio is very high. And it also doesn't mean that there's not some theoretical future state where it's going to cross a threshold where that is no longer the case, right? But at least kind of where we are now, however you ask the question, do you like the number of threes? Do you like the high scoring? Do you think the game's in a better place now than it was 5 years ago? All of those come back with these overwhelmingly positive ratios. I think my view is, first, I think it gets overstated how much we've legislated offense, right? So there was a package of rule changes back in 2001, the Colangelo Committee, when the game had gotten bogged down. Obviously, this was long before my time with the league, but it was a sort of very knockdown, drag out type basketball, and so the decisions around freedom of movement and opening up the lane and illegal defense and all these things to try to allow for more offensive movement, freedom of movement, motion, et cetera, and that worked, right? And it sort of set a spark in motion to kind of lead to this offensive explosion we've seen. But there hasn't been anything sort of fundamentally transformational since then. And a lot of it, the things we've done as a league are not actually driven at increasing scoring or increasing offense, right? What we've focused on is enforcing the things that are already in the rule book, right? Some of which were put in the early 2000s from a freedom of movement perspective, and others around actually reducing injury risk and injury rates. And that appears to be sort of benefiting offense, but the landing space for shooters, that was very much, again, back from a data perspective, we were seeing a higher rate of injuries, specifically, ankle and knee injuries when shooters were landing on defensive players' feet. And so creating more space for shooters to land, the possibility of a flagrant foul when a defender closes out and steps under a shooter. Those things were from a player protection standpoint, which of course in turn just helps shooters because it means you can't close out as aggressively, you can't cut under a shooter, and so now they've got more space. But I think that what you hit on is actually the much bigger piece here. It's this strategy piece, right? That teams have found where efficient shots are on the floor. Effective field goal percentage is also, not surprisingly, at an all-time high. Teams understand that three-pointers plays at the basket. I'm obviously, preaching to the choir here, but those things are where you can score efficiently. But the other thing is offenses figured out how to take advantage of the things that were already in the rule book. That if you see a defender in an illegal guarding position, you can generate contact and it's still the responsibility of the defender because they were in the illegal guarding position. So that's jumping into a shooter jumping into a defender you've drawn into the air, or on a drive to the basket, seeing a defender either inside the restricted or a secondary defender inside the restricted area, or not, jumping A to B and creating that contact. That is still a defensive foul by rule. And our teams and players have just gotten so much better at exploiting that to their advantage on the offensive side of the ball. And personally, I agree with you. I think we're at the point where we need to start to figure out how we can bring some balance back to that equation, mostly so that the offensive players don't feel the incentive to do that. Because it's not that we necessarily want less offense or want, the defense to be able to be more aggressive. But the issue for us is, does that actually decrease the aesthetic quality of the game, right? To me, yes. Like if an offensive player is junking up the game by jumping sideways while shooting, or sort of bowling ball driving to the lane and creating contact, that's not great for our game. But then the question is, okay, so how would you legislate against that, right? Do you want to move to a world where referees have much more subjective judgment about what is or isn't a natural basketball motion, and therefore reward the offensive player with a defensive foul call on a play, right? We've worked really, really hard to make our rules more black and white over time so we can be more transparent about correct and incorrect calls. And trying to undo that is actually really, really difficult, because now you're relying on 70 individual referees to make subjective judgments about whether something was a natural basketball move or not. And so we've sort of defaulted to, look, if you, a defender, are in an illegal guarding position, whether that's on the perimeter or around the basket, you are liable for the contact that is created, even if it's created by the offense. And so that's the challenge we have. But yes, my personal view is that there's a better balance that we could find, probably.
Yeah, and I think maybe for the purpose of our conversation here, our own subjective views are less of what I'm getting at than the things you're seeing from fans. I mean, if you're having fans sitting there turning up a dial on games, at least anecdotally, it seems from Twitter, or I've actually tried to run surveys with fans myself on this in the past, those little moments where they sense something isn't a basketball play, for instance, right? And then you have the double whammy of, you have the break in the game, you have to go to replay. We can get to replay more in a minute, right? You have all these things that maybe are compounding. And I think you made a great point. I'm asking less about teams being able to take advantage of space or shoot threes really well. Those things spiking up offense organically doesn't seem to cause a lot of uproar from fans. I think it's more of and let's stick with this phrase, like, what's an organic basketball play? And I'm glad you mentioned rigidity, because it feels like, to me, sometimes maybe if you actually only use really rigid boundaries in a game that needs some flexibility, you can kind of walk yourself into a corner. So that's maybe where I'm wondering if we've landed on.
Yeah, and I do think that the pendulum will start to swing back and say, look, basketball is by definition a game of some subjectivity in officiating, and that not every call on every play can be a black and white call, and we have to get comfortable with the gray area if we want to clean up some of the things that you're talking about. And I would just say, like, to build on one of the things you hit on, when you look at contact and how we officiate at different parts of the floor, right? What is a foul around the basket and the paint and the post is very different than what is a foul on the perimeter, but that's rules based, right? So like if you wanted to start to tilt the equation as to actually get at the efficiency of those shots, if you wanted to make 3-pointers less efficient to try to cut down on the number of them, well, you could allow more contact on the perimeter, right? You could reduce freedom of movement, bring back hand checking. There's a lot of things you could do there to sort of reduce the gap in expected points at different points on the floor. Obviously, plays at the basket are still very, very efficient and would become even more so on a relative basis if you officiate out on the perimeter more, more strictly. But those are the types of things we think about. And to your point about the dial testing, like, yeah, fans absolutely say that they don't like that, right? That when you see those sort of unnatural basketball moves, that's not an enjoyable aspect for fans. However, a point that often also gets overlooked is we are at a historical low in the entirety of the NBA in terms of foul calls per game, right, and free throw shot. So despite this massive offensive boom, despite these so-called unnatural moves leading to more calls, we don't have more calls in our game, right? And a lot of the reason for that is because the places where most calls happen, right, in the post, cutting, et cetera, like, we have less of it. We have more freedom of movement. We have more space. We have less post play. And so you're seeing fewer foul calls, which is great because, not surprisingly, fans also don't like fouls and free throws, right? They anything that's a stoppage in the game, a fan's going to tell you, I'd rather see action. And so there's a lot of interesting dynamics there at play that just make you a little more reticent to just say, okay, we're just going to flip this switch and say, we got to tilt it back in favor of defense, or we got to get back to a place of natural basketball motions, because it's a delicate balance across a lot of these issues.
Where is the data? Where are you guys currently at on something like free throws? There's been discussion of, switching to a single free throw instead of 2 free throws. Any insight on an issue like that?
Yeah.
I mean, it plugs right into what we're talking about.
So anyone who works with me will tell you that I am on a lifelong mission to eliminate the free throw, or eliminate as many free throws as we can. Again, fan data is clear there that it's not really an enjoyable part of the game. And we spend roughly 20 minutes administering fouls and free throws in any given NBA game, which is a lot of time in a 2-hour and 15-minute broadcast. And so We have tested, now this is the second year that we're testing the one free throw for 2 points or one free throw for 3 points in the G League. And so in all foul instances in the G League prior to the last 2 minutes, teams only shoot one free throw. And if it was a shooting foul for 2 points, shooting foul for 3 points, or a foul in the bonus, it's just one shot and you earn the same number of points. We saw free throw percentages go down a tiny bit, which makes sense because historically players shoot about 5% better on their second free throws than their first. And so you're taking away that second free throw opportunity. And we saved quite a bit of time. Interestingly, not as much time as we had projected. And the two reasons for that, and this is why we have the G League and why we'd love to be able to use it as an R&D lab, two things happened. One is we didn't properly account for the substitution time. So right now, foul occurs, there's 2 free throws coming, substitutions are done between the first and second free throw. And so coaches have that first free throw time to prepare to send in their sub, right? Now, with only 1 free throw shot, the subs have to be done before that free throw in the G. And so coaches are taking a little more time to get that substitute ready into the bench and to the table to check in. So that actually cut down on the time saved. And also there's a sense that players felt the shorter time for the overall free throw process. And given the expectation that they've all had their whole careers of, catching their breath during that free throw break, they lined up slower, right? They just took more time to get through the free throw process because they're like, well, I'm not going to have another 30 seconds after this first free throw to catch my breath before the next one. So you saw a slower process there. So that was interesting learning, right? And so we'll keep testing it there. But if we can prove with that G League data that 2 things happen: 1, you actually do cut down on the stoppage time consistently, and 2, that's something that fans find beneficial, right? And you haven't upended the competitive side of it, because in theory it's the same expected points. That's a change that I would hope you could see in the NBA at some point, although I will tell you basketball traditionalists are very much against it. So it's not like we're on the cusp of that change, but getting it to G League is at least the first necessary step.
Well, you mentioned something that I think is basically paramount to change it in game flow, especially in today's league where players are moving and running and cutting maybe more and harder than ever, which is that natural rhythm and break period that's built in to this like 2-hour long cardiovascular activity, right? And so the free throw is actually, I think, only one of those examples. Anytime you guys talk about changing timeout lengths, number of timeouts, TV timeouts, this is all part of the rhythm of the game. Any more kind of insight you can share specifically about monitoring players? And wearables gets into HIPAA and all these other things, but what kind of data and information can you use there to kind of strike a balance between improving game flow anytime you're looking at one of those initiatives versus, hey, we can't all of a sudden pull the carpet out from under the players when it comes to the actual athletic performance that's part of it?
Yeah, it's a great point. And, we've looked at this a few different ways. So the people are often, I think, a little too focused on the length of games, right? Like people talk about baseball game times, football, we're at around just under 250, I think about 212 this year. And we've kind of bounced up and down. We reduced our number of timeouts a few years ago, but we think about it much more as flow. And I define the flow of the game as the number and length of stoppages. Now, of course, the number and length of stoppages will directly lead to a different game length. I'm not saying those are disconnected, but the flow is what is felt by the fans. And so our prior research had showed that the sort of, yes, fouls are not great, free throws are not, from a fan perspective, free throws are not great, replays are not great, but by far the worst thing for fans is just a straight up commercial break, right? A timeout that leads to a commercial break. And so a typical game used to have a total of 18 potential mandatory and team timeouts, right? And that was cut to a max of 14 a few years ago, which is still a lot, but it's 2 to 3 per quarter, typically for an average game. And so what we looked at was, well, what is actually that cardio need for breaks? And is that more about the number and frequency of breaks or the length of the breaks, right? And so we don't have wearables data in game. We don't have cardio data in game, but we did a lot of anecdotal, study with our players that it was much, from their perspective, much more about the ability to take the break than the length. And in fact, if you look at, if you watch an in-arena cam or you're at a game, mandatory timeouts, quarter breaks that might be 3.5 minutes. a minute before those end, you got players back out on the court in a lot of cases ready to go, right? And they're almost sort of standing with hands on hips waiting for action to start. So that sort of signaled to us that the length of these breaks might actually just be more than we need right now. But when we cut down on the number of them, of course, back to the economic piece, we needed to maintain that advertising inventory. And so we actually just redistributed those ads across those breaks. We actually got longer, but fewer breaks. So that actually helped from a viewership perspective, but maybe didn't serve the exact purpose from a sort of player rest and recovery standpoint. So on the wearables front, one thing we did that I think is really important with our latest CBA in 2017, we established a wearables committee, and that committee has representatives from the Players Association and from the league. And the focus of that committee was to do three things. One, set up cybersecurity standards for any use of wearable technology, making sure if we're going to capture wearables data from our players, let's make sure that data is safe and secure. Two was to do validity and accuracy studies, right? We don't want to capture data that's not accurate, especially if it's going to lead to decisions about the game. And then three was a framework for in-game use. So right now, teams are permitted to use approved and accurate, meaning deemed accurate by our validation process, devices during practice, but they're not allowed to use them during game. And we've been actively negotiating with the Players Association to look at ways to bring that in game, because practices are only one part of the story here. We need to bring the game data in as well. And yeah, we really think that not that data we're going to use sort of on an individual player level, but if it could guide the rules and format, if it could guide structure that would reduce injury rates and elongate careers, we think it has tremendous benefit for both players and the league.
So there was a sort of built-in rest period that's kind of been added over the years, and I'm speaking cheekily to replay, right? Mm-hmm. Where you have now, instead of the extra TV timeouts, you get the replay. You're already sort of sighing at me mentioning this topic, so I won't push it too hard. But you did talk to Bill Shea at the Athletic last year, and one thing you mentioned to him about this is potentially chipping the ball to maybe help with some more automated calls. We've of course seen that in other ball-based sports. That's a tongue twister. Is that something that's on the horizon? Do you just individually see that as a potential panacea to some of these things, or is replay and kind of the uncertainty that you're trying to balance in terms of getting a certain number of calls right, letting the product flow, but also appeasing fans and teams in terms of fairness? That's a lot there, but talk to me about.
That's good. This is another one where my personal views diverge from the marketplace of ideas, I think. So I tend to think that the cost benefit equation or balance that relates to replay is not a favorable one. However, fan research shows very, very clearly that our fans would rather us spend a few extra minutes to ensure we get it right, as opposed to accepting that some calls will be wrong and getting through the game more quickly. And that kind of runs in conflict to some of those other things I mentioned about the research, which makes it sort of a paradox, right? Like fans say, we don't like the stoppages, we like action. However, if it means wrong calls, I don't want that, right? Now I'm willing to take the stoppage. And so I accept that. And so all that means to me is we got to find ways to do it faster, right? And more accurately, so that we're not going to replay as frequently and for as long. And so that's what the focus has been the last several years. And we got at that through some ways without technology. So we implemented I call it courtside administrator a couple of years ago. So there's now someone sitting at the scorer's table for every game in constant contact with the replay center. And the replay center actually makes some calls and changes directly without consultation with the on-court officials. So for example, it used to be that if a player made a shot on the perimeter that the referee wasn't sure whether it was a 2 or a 3, they would signal for replay. Now that's being done automatically. So if referee calls a 3, replay center has someone dedicated to that game. They're watching it. If they go back and look and say toe was on the line, they go straight to the courtside administrator, and that score just gets changed. It just gets changed at the table at the next stoppage in play, and the referees on court have nothing to do with it. And so that reduced the frequency that referees have to go to replay. But obviously, there's still a lot of plays where they're going, and the introduction of the coach's challenge brought many, many more where we now have to go look. And so that brings us to technology, which really is the only way that you're going to get step function changes in the amount of time it takes to do this. Sure, you could have better communication and microphones and video replays, but if it's a human doing it and there's 9 replay angles, like it's still going to take time. And so, yes, we've looked at what are the technological options here. You mentioned other sports. We watched very closely as, tennis has experimented. Well, they've always had the challenge system with Hawkeye, but US Open last year on Ash, and now Australian Open for the entire tournament had automated officiating with no lines people. So we studied that very closely. We've approached it from two different perspectives. One is a chip in the ball. And so we're actually switching ball providers from Spalding to Wilson. So that sort of delayed our timeline a little bit in developing chip balls. But of course, Wilson has an NFL ball with a chip in it. So we're optimistic that we can get there with them as well. And we're also looking at the camera-based systems like a Hawkeye or Respect or a Noah, these companies that do specifically around the basket, the location tracking of the ball. Now, that's not going to, in the short term, help you determine what it is or is not a foul. But some of the replays that take the longest for us, the out of bounds, the goaltending, the things, did a ball hit the rim to reset the shot clock, the things that can be definitively determined with either a chip-based system, a chip-based solution or a camera-based one, those are the things we think in the short term we could actually implement to significantly cut down. Then you could talk about, is there a longer term path here where we actually use, computer vision, AI, machine learning to determine what is or isn't a foul, what is or isn't a travel, to help augment the calls that the referees are making on the court. We're not saying pull the referees out, put out robots and officiate the game that way. That's not our reality, right? We're not tennis. But could you speed up those replay processes with some of those, computer vision and AI technologies that can start to get at a better understanding of what actually happened in a quicker time frame than a human looking at replay. So yeah, we're on all that. It's just obviously a fairly slow process to start to develop these algorithms and things and put them into play.
I just want to check with Megan or Seth, maybe if we want to leave a few minutes here. This might be a good time to switch to Q&A from the audience, but I can keep going, Evan, on this for a while. So let me
whatever Megan and the others and the crew wants.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to jump to Q&A if you want now. You have about 8 minutes left.
Okay, sounds good. So let's do that, Evan. Let's switch to some questions from the audience. Let me scan these. Ooh, here's an interesting one. We didn't really get into draft structure or changing the lottery. You mentioned some of the changes recently, of course. It's from Ethan Carpenter. How can data influence decisions regarding the one and done rule?
Yeah, so we did an incredibly in-depth quantitative study a few years ago when we initiated conversation with the union about changes to the one and done rule. This was I guess back in, I want to say 2017 or 18. And there's a number of ways to look at that, from the amount of information available to teams as it relates to, to high school players, and whether that's changed now versus when we most recently had, the 18 eligibility rule in the early 2000s, how well teams have drafted over time, and whether draft order is in fact as predictive of performance in the league as one would think, and whether that's gotten better. The prevalence of one and dones, the increase in the number of one and dones, and whether that has changed. The two things: either the success of players in their early years in the NBA versus the draft serving its purpose of restocking, underperforming teams. And so the tensions that you're talking about there are, one, what do you believe the philosophical purpose of the draft is, right? Do you want the draft to just be a method by which young players make it into the league, or do you want it to be something by which underperforming teams have access to better talent? And if the latter, then of course you'd want the most information available. And so you want to get at, is there a significant amount of information being gleaned from that one additional, the 19-year-old year, whether that's in college, overseas, G League, et cetera. And that was a big research study for us. And then the other piece of it is what actually benefits the league. So if there's a true superstar, a transformational player, well, we'd actually rather get that player in the league a year early, because that will mean more time for that player as an NBA player. Now, interestingly, it doesn't mean that you'll get an average of 1 year longer for that player, because there's something to be said for the wear and tear of that NBA year relative to a college year. Maybe you only get half a year on average, but that's still half a year. We'll take it. But on the other hand, the more influx you have of those young players, many of whom aren't ready to step into a rotation right away, maybe the overall lower quality product you've got because teams feel compelled to draft those players on potential, which they probably should, but in the short term, that's actually maybe hurting the product. And so there's a lot of moving pieces there. And basically what we did is just provide a sort of huge fact base of information around readiness to play, information gleaned from that 1 year of college, career length, injury rates, all these things about 18 and 19-year-olds, and fed that to, our legal team that was actively negotiating with the PA at the time about whether to change that rule. And of course, we've sort of put a pin in that for now, but we'll definitely come back to it at some point with the PA and figure out what makes sense, especially in light of all the changes in the marketplace you're seeing recently, right? We've launched our G League Ignite team, which is a new option for 19-year-old players and what would have otherwise been their college freshman year. And we saw quite a bit of uptake among top players for this year. You've seen a lot of players going international. So there's just a lot of changes that might make us look at it again, but data is absolutely at the core of that decision.
Maybe a quick one from Peter Z. He asked, have there been any early returns on this season's baseball-like home and home series that have been going on? And can we expect to see more of those in future seasons based on that?
Yeah, early returns are that they're just not that impactful, right? Like there's been a lot of third-party studies, no material difference in the home team winning percentage in the second one of those relative to what it would have been if that game had been played later in the season. Teams have mixed views. Some like it from a travel and sort of basketball planning perspective. Some don't like it because it actually, they sort of like to be able to play against more diverse styles, especially our top teams to prepare, over the course of a season. So we've gotten mixed reviews. The sole purpose of it in this year was to reduce travel because travel was perceived to potentially increase, our exposure risks in this season. So it'll just be a question of whether that travel reduction is beneficial in the future. The one key difference in the future, and the reason that it wasn't as much of a problem to go there this year, is there's historically been a view that, especially for, let's say, a non-star laden team, that having the same team for consecutive games in your home market is actually going to be a ticket sales challenge. And so without naming team names, if you've got some lower tier team coming in, for 2 straight games, can you attract your season ticket holders and your individual buyers to that second game? We didn't have to worry about this year because of the limited fans. So our team business folks may push back a bit in the future that actually we like more diversity of teams coming in. But if the basketball and travel benefits outweigh that, it's certainly something we'll consider for the future.
Sebastian K, if we are allowed to ask questions, which we are, I'm wondering if the NBA is looking at other leagues around the world for ideas or insights, and if so, which ones?
Yes, we would. I think it would be malpractice if we were not. So I've obviously talked about the tennis example. My other favorite one is sort of these, these secondary cups, right? That whether you have 82 games, 72 games, or some fewer lower number, it's still a long season, right? Our normal calendar starts in October and culminates in June with the crowning of a champion in our finals. Is there more we can do to create opportunity for teams to celebrate, something for fans to celebrate? And so we look to, the European soccer, European basketball, where there's the domestic league, there's a Champions League, there's domestic cups, which bring in other teams into the fold for knockout tournaments. So trying to cater a little bit to those international fans as well that we're trying to build. Can we add ideas like that to the mix? Now, we know that that's not going to be a success in year one because our teams just aren't, and our fans aren't primed to focus on, the secondary cup that we would host. But can you build it so that by year 5 or year 10, it actually holds maybe not as much prestige, but relatively high prestige to the Larry O'Brien, for example.
All right. I think we are out of time. Unfortunately, I feel like I could riff on these all day, but Evan, thank you so much. That was a lot to pack in only 44 and a half minutes. So
spoke quickly for you, Ben.
I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben.